OPEC have decided to cut down oil production in a meeting held in Vienna. What does this mean to Europe? Having such a meeting at the heart of Europe, the winter is coming, and all that. What can Europe do or the US do to OPEC? What impact does it have on the Indian economy? Samarth also has a similar question. It seems like Saudi Arabia and Russia are working together to manage oil markets. What are your thoughts on this, and what will the West do now? Will EU be forced to come at peace with Russia by the upcoming winter? Harita says, what do you make of the current situation between the US and Saudi Arabia? Do you think Saudi Arabia is trying to break free of American control over their sovereignty? Interesting questions. So, yes, what's happened is that the OPEC group got together, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they got together and they decided to cut down, reduce the production of oil by approximately 2%. The Americans had been exhorting them to do the opposite of that. They wanted the OPEC countries to increase oil production. But they have decided, the OPEC group has decided to cut down oil production by 2%. So they have gone against the wishes of the Americans, right? So what's going on here? So let's understand what the background is. Um, so you had the COVID crisis, right? The 2 years that we all lost. Yeah, the whole world was locked down. During this time there was a very significant decline in demand for oil. So oil became incredibly cheap. It became, at some point in time, I remember the price went to below zero, so they would actually give you money to acquire oil. That's a whole different story, let's not go there. But yeah, oil prices became really, really, really cheap during the COVID crisis. Then you had the Ukraine conflict. Then the COVID thing started going down, and the oil prices started again rising somewhat. Then you had the Ukraine special operation ordered by Mr. Putin, which sent oil prices skyrocketing. Oil prices really shot up, and during this time, Saudi Arabia became one of the fastest growing economies in the world because of the high oil prices and high demand for oil. Then then you had a new wave of COVID in China, because of which demand went down. And now the Europeans and the Americans are trying to put a price cap on the oil that they buy from Russia, which means the Russians cannot sell oil to them above a certain price. The Russians obviously will not sell oil to anybody who insists on a price cap and all that. And now you have inflation, you have all these problems. So the oil prices, the gas prices in the US are quite high. There is inflation, and there is the midterm elections coming up in November this year, right, which is very crucial for the Republicans and the Democrats both. So the Republican Party, which is currently in power, Mr. Biden is in power apparently, so they were exhorting Saudi Arabia and the OPEC countries to increase oil production so that the oil prices go down in the US and they can hopefully win the midterm elections. And the Saudis have done the exact opposite. OPEC has done the exact opposite, which could possibly make it harder for the Republicans to win the midterm elections this November, right? So that's what's happened. So, by cutting down on oil production, there will be increase in the oil prices, and that's going to help the economies of these nations. So, what are the consequences of this? First of all, it's going to help Russia. Uh, so it will be harder for Europe and essentially for Europe to insist on an oil price cap on vis-a-vis trading with Russia, because if there is less production, then they may be desperate to buy oil from wherever it's available. So it will become harder for them to impose sanctions and to punish Russia for acting in its own national interest. So that's the consequence on Europe. It's going to it's not it's it will the effect will be that it will not the inflation will not be alleviated in the US unless the US does something dramatic, and oil prices will stay high in the US. Gas prices will stay high, which is going to make the people unhappy, because people don't like high gas prices. The gas prices have shot up quite a bit in the US. So that's the deal. So these nations will benefit from this, and yeah, Russia will also benefit from this. So it is something that helps Saudi Arabia, it helps the OPEC countries, it helps Russia. It is detrimental to Europe, it is detrimental to the US. The Americans are not going to be happy, especially with Saudi Arabia, who essentially has always been their vassal state. Yeah, Saudi Arabia was created by the British, and when the British Empire's power center was transferred from London to Washington, the Americans took over control of Saudi Arabia, and they have essentially treated Saudi Arabia as a client state, and they have forced Saudi Arabia to buy incredible amounts of US weapons, yeah, and indulge in various conflicts in the region to keep the Middle East on the boil. And Saudi Arabia has been their reliable and perpetual supplier of oil and petroleum products. Now the Saudis are they're trying to act independent. That is dangerous. That's dangerous not for the US, it's dangerous for Saudi Arabia, right? I hope Mr. MBS Mohammed bin Salman knows what he is doing, because you go against the wishes of the US, especially when you are a vassal state. Who knows what can happen? Remember Iraq? Iraq was a US vassal state. They propped up Saddam Hussein. They turned him into a great guy. They gave him weapons to fight a war against Iran. There was the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s. Both nations suffered a lot. Eventually, there was a ceasefire. Yeah. And then when Mr. Saddam Hussein started acting on his own, you know what happened to him, right? So I hope Mr. Mohammed bin Salman knows what he is doing. He is going straight head on against the diktats of his masters, the United States. He's going against the US national interest. So that is a dangerous, dangerous game for Mr. Mohammed bin Salman to play. So yes, it looks like they're trying to break free at some level from American control over their sovereignty, which is, it's dangerous. Now, what is the effect on India? As oil uh, production is reduced, oil prices will go up, which means prices of petroleum products, of petrol, of diesel, of whatever else is going to rise. These prices will rise in India, which means the prices of all commodities will rise in India. See, yeah, that's what India is going to face as well. That's just how it goes. These when these things happen, they have a global ripple effect. So it's India should be prepared for this, that prices of all essential things, of food stuffs, of everything essentially will rise to a certain extent in the coming days, weeks, and months. Yeah, that's where we are. This is all part of the big global game of geopolitics we are witnessing. The OPEC nations are trying to go against the will and the wishes of the United States. Mr. Mohammed bin Salman is taking a very, very bold step over here. So what's going on? Does he have some big nations support? We know that India and Saudi Arabia have excellent relations now. Yes. There could be something brewing between the Saudis and the Chinese, the Saudis and the Russians. The Russians are clearly benefiting from this. Right now, China seems very quiet, doesn't it? The Chinese seem to be very sidelined, and they have their own internal matter to deal with. The ascension of Xi Jinping to another 5-year term. Yeah, his crowning is the confirmation of his crowning as the emperor. He disappeared for some time, then he reappeared briefly. A whole lot is happening right now in the world. So yeah, so that is what the OPEC oil production cut is about, and that's the kind of ripple effect, the kind of consequences it's going to have immediately on the world, immediately, or in the near upcoming future, and what kind of effect it will have geopolitically for the leadership of the OPEC countries, for Saudi Arabia and other such nations, for Mohammed bin Salman, remains to be seen. But it's a dangerous gamble they've taken. It's a dangerous game they're playing, especially Saudi Arabia.